peace like a river in my soul. I've got peace like a river. I've got peace like a river. I've got peace like a river in my soul. I've got love like an ocean. I've got love like an ocean. I've got love like an ocean in my soul. I've got love like an ocean. I've got love like an ocean. I've got love like an ocean in my soul. I've got joy like a fountain. I've got joy like a fountain. I've got joy like a fountain in my soul. I've got joy like a fountain. I've got joy like a fountain. I've got joy like a fountain in my soul. I've got peace, love, and joy like a river. I've got peace, love, and joy like a river. I've got peace, love, and joy like a river in my soul. I've got peace, love, and joy like a river. I've got peace, love, and joy like a river. I've got peace, love, and joy like a river in my soul. When peace like a river attended my see my sins upon his cross, and I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon. Let's sing that one more time. And I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. So here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God, you're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Amen. You can have a seat.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now
Good evening, everybody. I was afraid the pastor was going to ask me to introduce our guest speaker. And the reason why you'll understand after he's had a chance to talk than before. But I was thinking through the day that I had today. Oh, good, it's working. And I had a great day. It was one of those days that you can rejoice in. So My wife and I had coffee in bed. We were able to watch CBS Sunday Morning. I had avocado toast for brunch, if you ever had avocado toast. We were able to work in our garden a little bit. We had dinner with friends. And then I knew I was coming here tonight, and I was going to be able to introduce you to some of my most favorite people, So all day it was one of those days that you could be glad in the Lord and you can rejoice. But not all days are like that. As believers, we know we're at times in the valley. We've got struggles. And some days it can be difficult to rejoice. I'm reminded of a story Corrie ten Boom tells of her sister. They had just arrived at the concentration camp. It was their first night. They were attempting to sleep. The beds were covered in fleas and lice. And Corrie's question to the Lord was, why? And I think mine would have been, why? But she hears her sister Betsy praying, show me, show us how. Her interest was, how can the Lord use them where they were in order to bring the love of Christ? Her mind was somewhere else. It was the Lord's plan, not her plan. My attempt is to always shorten the distance between my sort of why prayers and my how prayers. That's my struggle, and that's what I work on. The Lord gives us illustrations in the Bible of people of God, and he gives illustrations to simple people like me with those struggles to say, well, here's Paul and Silas, here's how they did it. But sometimes those stories of long ago are difficult for me to apply, and so he gives simple people like me people today. And so today, I wanted to introduce to you David Boyce. He asked the how much quicker than I would have, but God's given me him as a great illustration and a model of his word in practice. So I want to introduce to you David Boyce.
Well, I hope what I have to say actually lives up to what he just said himself. Thank you for having me here. It's quite an honor to be able to talk about what God's done in my life. So that was actually a really good introduction to what I wanted to ask you first, or what I was going to say. So what would your reaction be if I told you God was a liar, he doesn't always get it right, and his plans aren't always the best? How would you react to that? You'd say, well, I was wrong, absolutely. Well, we know that now, and hindsight lets me see that. But when we're going through things, we do ask why. We do question whether or not God is actually right in the midst of what we go through, because how would he allow things to happen in our lives that seem contrary to what he says in his word? And that happens a lot, I think, to all of us. And it happened to me. So, has anybody heard my story besides Chuck and Lauren? Okay, good, fresh people. So, I grew up in a very small little place in Ohio. I had a blue-collar, middle-of-the-road family, a very large country family. I grew up in the woods, hunting, fishing, trapping, doing all those things. My earliest memories is catching a largemouth bass when I was about this big, and at that big, it was this big when I caught it. But it was actually only about this big. But it was a monster for me. I had this really great family. They loved me. They disciplined me. My father adopted me at a very young age and treated me just like his own son. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He met all my needs, but he actually went through Vietnam, and he did not come back the same man as when he went. But he had a very hard upbringing in West Virginia, raised by his grandparents, very strict. So he was very strict to start with. When he came back from Vietnam, things kind of went askew with the way he handled things. But he was the best father he knew how to be, and I can appreciate that now. But when I turned 18 and I had the ability to leave home, I did. So I wanted to make my own decisions. I wanted to make my own choices. My old man was crazy. He had never lived a life. He didn't know what he was talking about. There's no way he could possibly relate to the things that I felt, was going through, or the things I wanted to do. I found out later, I had to humble myself and apologize to him many decades later, that he was absolutely right about everything, and I hated that, but I rebelled against everything he told me I shouldn't do. That ended up having me in situations that got me in a lot of trouble. Before it was over, in May 24th, 1990, on my 20th birthday, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm really terrible with dates, but I remember that one very well. I was arrested and charged with capital murder and robbery. That was a very sobering day for me. A friend of mine had been killed, and the police believed I did it, and they arrested me. And that began a very long 23-year journey to get where I am today right now. I was not a believer. My parents sent me to Sunday school when I was about yay high so they could get a couple hours of peace and quiet for themselves. The bus would come by and pick all the kids up, so I was made to go to Sunday school. Didn't really believe, never gave my life to Christ, anything like that. When I became a teenager, I did what teenagers do. When I became a young adult, I went out on my own, and God was the farthest thing from my mind and the farthest thing from my life. So I was in the military. I ended up getting kicked out of the military because I like to do things my way, and in the military they don't like that. They like it their way. And I was honorably discharged, but I was given a choice. You could either voluntarily leave or we will kick you out. So I voluntarily left. From there, I had a really bad first marriage, and things just went really downhill quick. May 24th, 1990, I was arrested. I was raised, like I said, in a very small area. I knew who all the cops were where I lived. I knew the deputies and the sheriffs, and we knew the State Highway Patrol because they were all our neighbors. And the term serve and protect actually meant something then. And our cops actually had a program that on Christmas and New Year's Day, all you had to do was call the State Highway Patrol, and they would give you a ride home, just to make sure that you didn't drive drunk. That's the kind of family or the environment that I grew up in. So I believed in the police. I believed in the system. I believed that justice was real. And when all of this happened, I turned to God real quick. It's amazing when everything's going right in our lives, or we think it is, and we're having fun. God's the furthest thing from our mind. And then as soon as everything goes south, it's like, God, why did you let this happen to me? Which is where I was. But I believed in the system. A year and a half later, I went to trial, and after 4 days, I was found guilty. And a month after that, I was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. So at 21 years old, I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison and die there. That's what my fate was. I was treated unbelievably inhumanely, to the point where I won't even talk about the details. It was an eye-opener, and I had to grow up very quickly. I went to the most secure prison they had in Virginia at the time, which was Greensville Correctional Center, which replaced Spring Street. So that's where all the murderers, rapists, and thieves went. And I was considered a murderer, a rapist, a thief, all the other. These were my people now, and I had to learn how to live in that environment. And it was not an easy thing to do because it was completely contrary to what I had grown up with. I mean, it was just a complete opposite. And in prison, everything is opposite. So what we consider to be right out here is considered wrong in there, and what we consider to be wrong out here is considered right in there. And respect is based on fear and violence and what you can make somebody do, not get somebody to do. So that was the life that I was plunged into. So at 21 years old, I had to learn how to navigate that. And in my pride, I learned how to navigate that very well. And I took to it very easily. And it was a very violent world that we lived in, and it was a very violent life that I had. And I was part of a gang, and we did a whole lot of things that gangs do in there. And in the year 2000, I was up on Keene Mountain Correctional Center, which is probably one of the worst prisons in Virginia, and I'd had enough. I'd spent 10 years in prison. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison. My grandfather just died at 95 in December. Most of the men in my family lived to be very, very old. And I'm laying on my bunk and I'm sitting there thinking, man, how am I going to do the next 60 years in prison like this? How can I do that? It wasn't God, how am I going to do this? It's like, man, how am I just going to do this? But in that moment, there was a small break in my heart. And I cried out to God with all the sincerity that I could muster and all the truthfulness was in me. And I said, God, if you're real, you're going to make yourself real in my life. Do something to let me know you're real or I'm done. Just that simple. I am not spending 60 years like this. I'm done. And I was going to take myself out. Now, if you don't know anything about the DOC, I have 2 consecutive life sentences. I'm 30 years old. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in there. I was put in a facility to house me for at least 10 years. I was not eligible for a transfer. I couldn't even ask for one. And 3 days later, they told me to pack my stuff. I was getting transferred. 3 days after I called out to God, pack your stuff, you're getting transferred. They had a security threat at another prison, and they needed to swap somebody. And I just happened to be the one they picked. And I got sent to another prison. Oddly enough, with 2 consecutive life sentences, I got sent to a lower security institution, which I was never supposed to be at. I spent the next 13 and a half years on that institution. And in that time, God, in all his infinite wisdom, started bringing people into my life to let me know that he loved me, to let me know that he cared, to let me know he had a plan. And of course, I ignored all of that. Has anybody in here heard of Kairos besides Chuck? Kairos is an awesome prison program. And the chaplain there kept trying to get me to go to Kairos, and I tell him I would. And it's a full weekend Christian seminar. And the guys come from outside. They spend the entire week with us. They leave at night, come back. They eat the food with us. They spend 12 hours with us. It's a really spectacular program. But I didn't want to go. I was too busy being me. I was too busy being mad. I was too busy having pride and anger get in the way of what God really wanted to do with me and show me. But eventually I seen a sign-up list on the bulletin board for Kairos, and I said, well, I'm just going to sign up. I don't have to go. I'll sign up. I don't have to go. And then they sent me a pass. And I said, well, I don't have to go. But then they sent me another pass. So I went. And I went the first night, and my sponsor, Carl Wright, wonderful man. We have been friends ever since. And the story of our meeting gets bigger and bigger, I think, with every time he tells it. But imagine me at about 205 pounds. My head's completely bald. I've got tattoos on my head. And I've got tattoos everywhere. Like I said, I fell into prison life very easily. And here I am with a chip on my shoulder, bigger than all outdoors. And here's this guy telling me that he's glad to meet me. And I was like, you are nuts. But we had a good time. Well, I fought and screamed the whole weekend to get out of it, and every time I'd come up with something that I thought would get me out of the weekend, God would just turn it around and just change the rules. He really would. He would just change the rules in the middle of the game that would allow me to keep going back, and I did, and it changed my life. I didn't give my life to Christ that weekend, but it changed my life forever, and God just kept pulling me to go to church. And there was this guy that used to come in on Friday nights with his guitar. He was an ex-heroin heavy metal junkie. And he would come in, he gave his life to Christ, and he would come in and he would play the most spectacular Christian songs. I've never heard anything like it, like the last one we sung there at the end. I didn't even know who Hillsong was or music like that. The only Christian music I knew were like the hymns from like the 1800s. And that just kind of wasn't my style of music. But I started listening to this, and God used that guy to start working. And then he just started bringing more people into my life. So I told you I was convicted of capital murder and robbery and sentenced to 2 life sentences. The reason I stand here today is because I was able to prove after 23 years that I was actually innocent. My entire record has been expunged. It's like it never happened on paper. But it did happen. I spent 23 years in prison for a murder I didn't commit. And it took 23 years, even after DNA and somebody else confessing to the crime and all these other things that proved that I was innocent. It still took 23 years for them to correct the mistake and release me. So here I am in prison now, and I just had my last appeal, and I knew I was going home. The DNA came back. It wasn't me. And I knew I was going home, and the day before Thanksgiving, I got the letter from the court saying, nope, you ain't going home. We don't care. You've got to finish out your sentence. And that was the moment that me and God got real. Well, I should say that was the moment I got real with a real God. And I sat down on my footlocker, and I just bawled my eyes out. Because up to that point, I mean, we had countless opportunities to prove my innocence, and everything got turned down. I'd been turned down by every court in the state 3 times. Every court over a 15-year period, 3 times. And it just seemed hopeless at that point. And I sat down on my footlocker, and I just kind of bawled my eyes out, and I poured my heart out to God, and I said, all right, God, I am never going to go through this kind of disappointment again. I will never ask another person for help. If you want me out of prison, you've got to do it yourself. I will never ask for help, and I meant it with all my heart. I was never going to ask another human being to help me get out of prison. It was going to be God or nobody. And it was God. A month later, a guy came up to me, and he says, look, man, I want you to meet this person who's coming to see me. And I went and I met her, and she, a really wonderful lady, she ended up being the treasurer for the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project out of Washington, D.C., and their entire goal is to get innocent people out of prison. That's what they do. And up to that point, I had tried for almost 15 years to get them to take my case, and they refused me. They wrote me a letter, said, please stop writing. We will never help you. Have your family stop calling. We don't have the resources to help you. Now God brought them to me. And within 30 days after that meeting, they took my case. From there, I had a complete battalion of attorneys. But I remember meeting the lead attorney on my case, a guy by the name of Eddie. In our first meeting, he comes in, and I'm sitting in this little room, and here comes this guy. Doesn't look much older than this young man right here. He's fresh out of law school. He's doing his little intern stuff, and he comes in and he goes, hey, my name's Eddie Ferrer, and I'm your attorney. And I was like, man, it's Doogie Howser, and I'm never going to get out of prison. I will never get out of prison with this guy. He's younger than my children. But he ended up being a believer, a great friend, and an awesome attorney. So again, here I am thinking in my own terms and not God's terms. But I thought I was going to get out. And again, it was appeal after appeal, turn down after turn down. But in that moment, God showed me purpose. He showed me grace. He showed me what it was. I remember, and I told Linda about it. I woke up the day that I finally gave my life to Christ. I woke up that morning. I'm laying in my bunk, and something was different. And every time I closed my eyes, I could see Christ on the cross and feel my sin that put him there. And that went on for the entire day. Fortunately, I had a single cell, and I sat in that cell all day and just bawled and repented and asked for forgiveness and asked for grace and apologized and told him, I'll never do anything else again. If you'll just get me out of this, God, I'll be the perfect Christian. And of course, we know that wasn't going to be true. And so did he. And I wasn't ready to get out yet. But at the moment of my last turn down for DNA, I had been writing Linda for 10 years probably at that point. And we'd become pretty good friends. And I figured I was going to be around for a while, so I invited her to come see me. And she finally came on January 15, 2005. Did I get that one right? Yep, January 15, 2005. She finally came to see me. We were married the following August of 2006. And she spent every weekend driving almost an hour and a half one way, 2 hours. 2 hours, 10 minutes. 2 hours, 10 minutes every weekend to drive up to Augusta County to see me. And that went on for 8.5 years that she came to see me. I think out of that 8.5 years, she missed 7 visits due to sickness, weddings, and surgery. And little by little, God started changing me. He didn't change my circumstances. He didn't change my situation. He didn't change my probability of being released, but he changed me. And in the midst of this maximum security institution, God took this very hard heart and he changed it around and he gave me purpose. And at that point, though I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in prison, if I had to spend the rest of my life in prison, and if that was God's will, then that's what we were going to do. And Linda and I had spoke about that, and she was in it with me, down in the trenches, and I had more than resigned myself. I had accepted God's plan. If that's your plan, I don't have to agree with God's plan. I just have to agree that he's right and it's good, even if I don't understand it. Even if I don't understand the whys, he showed me the hows, and he started to equip me. So here's a guy that could not stand in front of more than 2 people and speak it without my tongue swelling up and going dry, my knees literally knocking, my stomach would be nauseated. And God ended up taking that individual who used to hate Christians because they always look so darn happy, even in prison, and he changed my heart and started just moving in my life. So I went from somebody who could not speak in public to somebody who was leading praise and worship in prison, which was just absolutely crazy. And I ended up having a spot in the chaplain's office. So I worked for the chaplain, and it wasn't a paid position, but I was allowed to go to the chaplain's office every single day and work for the chaplain. I was involved, I had the privilege of being involved in over 40 baptisms of men inside. I mean, that was just an extreme honor and privilege. And then the purpose he showed me was to work with people in prison. And that's what I did. What a good purpose to have while you're there, because, you know, the inventory is great. You know, you're not going to run out of prisoners while you're in prison. And he would start bringing guys to me. And he'd bring me these little young gangbangers, Bloods and Crips and MS-13s. These were cold-blooded killers. And they were hurting. These guys still hurt inside. It doesn't matter how hard they are. It doesn't matter if they could actually take a person's life with no regret. They still hurt inside because they still had a heart. And they would hurt, oh my goodness. And they would come to me, and I'd have the opportunity to walk the yard. And if you want to see something really funny, here's this tattooed white guy walking around the rec yard with a Blood or a Crip. And not only is it unusual, most times it's not allowed, but the administration let me do it because they knew what was going on. And I found, he came to me, a young man named Victor, and I loved him. Oh, I just fell in love with this guy as if he was my own son. And he was in MS-13, and he was a hitman, and he was a cold-blooded killer. But he would hurt so much inside, and he would just pour himself out to me and cry because he couldn't do it with anybody else, because then he'd be seen as weak. And we would walk the yard, and his homies would start cracking on him in Spanish, and I'd know what they were saying. And then, you know, it was really odd. Here we are, we're talking about Christ, and he'd start cussing them out and telling them to mind their own business and all this. And we fell in love with him and his whole family. And I hope he's still out. He ended up getting deported. But God gave me that purpose. So we resigned ourselves to be doing that, and that's what we did. And God just gave us opportunity after opportunity. I would have guards come to my cell at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and ask me to pray with them. The administration would ask me to pray with them. These were the opportunities God was giving me. And this was my training ground for the life and the plans and the purpose in which God had created me for, that I ran from so many years before, that he brought me full circle to a place where I could say, God, you're right. I'm the liar. Ooh. I was the liar. I was the one that was wrong. And I'll paraphrase Paul out of Romans, and he talks about let God be true and every man a liar. At the end of the day, let God be true and every man a liar, because his plans are perfect. His plans they're just wonderful. And we don't have to understand them. But I learned about grace. And that's what I talk about a lot. I learned my own grace story. And I try to encourage everybody, everywhere I go, find out what your grace story is. And find a way to articulate that to other people so that they know the God you serve. So they know how awesome he is. So they know how loving he is. So they know how forgiving, and most of all, how faithful he is, even when it looks like the storms and the waves are going to overcome us and drown us. He is still there, ready to just pluck us out and say, why did you doubt? I've had you so many times in the past, and I'm going to have you so many times in the future. So that's what he was teaching me. So one night, I'm sitting in my cell, and we'd had an appeal in for 8 or 9 months in the federal court. And I'm sitting in my cell, and I have 2 officers come up to my cell at count time, and that was in 2013, after we'd done 23 years in prison, after I had assigned myself or resigned myself to do the rest of my life in prison. These 2 guards come up to my cell, and they say, look, you need to call home when count clears immediately. And that can never be good when they tell you to call home immediately. So I'm figuring my mom's dead, or it's my wife, something's wrong with my wife, or something's going on and it's not good and I'm not going to be happy. And I've got the next 20 minutes to sit in there and mull this over and say, God, what is going on? As if things aren't bad enough. And finally count clears and the door opens. I go out, I call home, and Linda answers the phone. Let me cover this up because it gets loud. And all I can hear is, you're coming home, you're coming home. And I couldn't understand a word she said at all. But what had happened earlier that day, a judge had decided that I had been wrongfully convicted, overturned my case, vacated my sentences, and ordered the Department of Corrections to release me. But at 4:30, they wouldn't allow my attorneys to come in and tell me, because business hours were over. So they wouldn't allow me to know that I was actually getting released. So the attorneys didn't have my wife's number, which I thought was strange. So they ended up calling a reporter down in Newport News, and this reporter had my wife's number and called her and told her about it. And then she called up and said it was an emergency, I had to call home. And the crazy thing is, so I was in an old-timers pod, and we were all kind of like cadre workers. There was only 32 of us. Almost everybody in there was over the age of 45. So by 10:30 at night, everybody's sleeping. But at this point, everybody already knows I'm innocent. And they've been really good about encouraging me and everything. And I finally find out that my case has been overturned and everybody's sleeping. I don't have a single person to tell. I don't have a single person to tell that all the prayers of so many people have finally been answered and that God was faithful. So I had to go wake people up. And after Linda and I got done crying and talking and praising God, I did. And it was incredible. So 23 years fighting, kicking, screaming to get out of prison with no results. Within 3 days, they kicked me out. Literally. If it would have happened on a Wednesday, I would have been home the next day, or I'd have been out the next day. But since it happened on a Thursday, things don't move very quickly on Fridays with the government. I had to wait till Monday, and they came up first thing Monday morning, and they gave me this release paper, said, sign this, your ride will be here at 10 o'clock, get your stuff. And you know the crazy thing about it, I was like, can I have some more time? I have people that I want to talk to. I have people that I want to say goodbye to. I built relationships with men in there that were meaningful. I had built family with people within the church that were closer to me than my own family, because my own family had abandoned me for all intents and purposes while I was inside, because they believed that I was guilty and they didn't want to associate with that. They all changed their mind when they found out I was innocent, and then they all came back. But the moral of all of this, because as you can tell, I did get out. And that was probably harder than doing time. This is a crazy world that we live in. And I spent 23 years in prison. I'd never used a cell phone. I had no idea how to do a computer. The internet didn't exist when I got locked up. And I couldn't even call my mother when I was released. I had to have Linda dial the number because I didn't know how to use a cell phone. And I had a lot of trouble dealing with crowds and putting my back to the walls. And so, you know, God gave me the right woman in Linda. You know, she truly is my better half. When he says he's going to give us a helpmeet, he really does. She was the right woman for the job, even though sometimes I think she would probably want to get paid more for it. But she was the right woman for the job, and I couldn't. So again, it goes right back to what I was saying, how God's plans are always perfect. So now we go back to the very prison that I spent 13 years in. We are approved volunteers within the Virginia Department of Corrections, and we go back to deliver hope and love of Jesus Christ, because they know what I went through. They saw me go through it, and I promised them if I ever went home, I'd be back, and nobody believed me. And now we go back, and we had to fight to get back in prison. How crazy is that? They kicked me out, and we fought to get back, and that's a whole nother testimony of how great God is, because we were actually approved by the Department of Corrections head. The head guy of the DOC approved us to go back to my prison, and I call it my prison. Before it was like their prison, and I got to get the heck out of it, and here we are. Find out your grace story. Learn how to articulate it, and then share it with other people so they know how great God is. Because we serve an awesome God. And it doesn't matter how bad the situation seems. It doesn't matter how hard it is. It's not your job to go through it alone. It's not your job to determine how to get through it. It's your job to trust the God who allowed that to happen to bring you through it so he can show you how great he is and how powerful he is and how much he loves you and how much grace he has to get us through anything. I spent 23 years in prison for a murder I didn't commit. And though I would never re-enlist for it, I can honestly say it was the best thing that ever happened to me. As hard as it was, and as tragic as it was for the victim's family, it is why I am who I am today. And out of those 23 years, I ended up becoming a licensed electrician. I ended up becoming Mrs. Linda Boyce, or Mr. Linda Boyce, I should say. So I met my wife. I found a trade. We now have a company where we hire ex-felons to give them a second chance like God gave us. So I encourage you, give people second chances. It's not about prison. We're involved with McShin. Second chance, we all need second chances. Third chances, fourth chances, fifth chances. But that's my grace story. That's the story God gave me to try to encourage other people. And I hope tonight it has. Because again, no matter what we go through, we've got a God who brings us through it.
Well, I've never heard anything like that. Have you? Just amazing. And I've got more sense than to try to teach the Bible now. We are through with that part of it. But it's worth it. I noticed, sir, and I wish we could have lunch sometime.
If you're buying, absolutely.
No, but I'm married to a woman who's got money, so.
We got a lot in common.
Yeah, good. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. That was so wonderful. Two things stand out for me, and then we'll have our time of testimonies and requests. He kept saying, the Lord kept bringing people to him to bless him, to serve him. That's what we're going to talk about next week in the 8th chapter of Acts. Bringing joy. We'll look at that. And the other thing is, I'd have to say, Brother David, the Lord, through the Holy Spirit, has now given you God's perspective on the reality you've been through. You see it like it really is now. That's God's view. You're his child. He's letting you see it the way it is. So thank you very much for that. And we all need that, do we not, for our present living in this time. Thank you, sir, for coming. Now, let me just pray quickly, and then we're going to have our requests. Father.